Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on how to bootstrap PR during a downturn. So I'm your host, Rudi Davis. I'm the head of agency at Intelligent Relations, which is a PR platform where you can do your own PR using our SaaS services. A couple of points of order before I get on with the webinar. So we're recording this and we'll send it out to all attendees after the event, so you can rewatch it in your own time. Second point as well, I'll be hosting a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. So as I go along, any questions you've got, please put them into the webinar chat and I'll be answering those at the end. And the first part of the webinar will be a short slideshow that I'm going to go through. Firstly, a bit of context as to sort of how to conceptualize PR. And then I'm going to go into some specific techniques that you can use start getting media coverage for your own business. So here's what we'll cover. Firstly, a bit of theory, then getting your house in order before you start PR, then media and journalist targeting, when and how to use press releases, guest post pitching for beginners, how to respond to journalist requests, media monitoring and relationship building, cold pitching do's and don'ts, and then, as I say, the Q&A at the end of the session. So firstly, I'll jump right in with theory, and I won't spend too long on this part as it's better to hear how to do things from a practical perspective, but it's still useful to just frame things with a certain theoretical understanding. So firstly, the golden rule, and this is what we tell clients working with us, is that PR isn't just about press releases. And what I mean by this is a lot of businesses, unless you're a huge multinational or you're a blue chip company, a lot of businesses fall into one of these problems when it comes to over-relying on press releases. One might be they're a small to medium-sized company or you're a startup, and there's just a lack of genuinely newsworthy announcements in any one month. You're a typical small or medium-sized business. They may have 3 or 4 genuine announcements that they could go out to the media with in any one year that could get media coverage. And then they've got to figure out what do they do in between that to keep getting media coverage and to stay in the public eye. The second problem we have with over-relying on press releases is that a lot of small, medium-sized businesses or startups will have low name recognition and social proof. They can find it difficult pitching press releases and getting those published. Thirdly, it takes quite a bit of work to write up a press release, send it out. And of course, most businesses have limited resources. And moreover, lack of experience in media relations and understanding when and how to use this type of technique, when to use it, when not to use it, which I'll go on to later in this webinar. The second golden rule, and this one can be a little bit tough to take, but it's important to understand this and help you frame how you're trying to get media coverage. That's that journalists, unfortunately, don't really care about your product. That can sound a little bit counterintuitive as most people, when they think of PR, is getting a journalist to write up about how great their product or service is. While those types of results are possible, they're kind of seen as the ultimate that you can get in the PR industry. It takes a lot of work building up to those kind of results. And there's a lot of other type of PR and media wins that you want to be getting before you reach that stage, which I'll talk to you about in this webinar. And then the third golden rule that we always tell clients that we're working with is to paraphrase an ex-president, ask not what a journalist can do for you, ask what you can do for a journalist. So by this, we always mean that journalists day in, day out get inundated with pitches from companies trying to get them to write about their product or service. Most journalists are going to get turned off by this. They're not there to promote products, they're there to tell stories. So when we're approaching media, we always need to think of ways we can frame pitches into a broader narrative, into a story, into a hook, into something that isn't just talking about themselves, which again, we'll go through during this webinar. So next up, in terms of getting your house in order before you start PR, and this is something we do with our clients. It's a bit of a housekeeping exercise, a bit of an audit to make sure we got the fundamentals in place. We're not skipping a step before we go out there to try and get media coverage. So we break this into 3 key areas. So firstly, website. Are you page one for brand search? So if a journalist searches for your brand, are they going to find you within the first couple of results of Google? Or are you just not going to appear there at all? You want to make sure you're present, or else you might lack credibility that a journalist might pass. Is the website just kind of up to date, free of errors, filler text, broken links? It's looking and working correctly. Do you have a completed about us team pages so journalists can look into you, do their due diligence, understand who's behind the business? And is the sort of design up to standard? You're rubbing shoulders with your peers. In terms of social media, again, getting the basics in place, profiles up to date, teams professional profiles, having some published LinkedIn articles is always great so journalists can see the type of content that you're talking about, the type of stories that you're putting out. And if you're a startup or a tech company, you have a Crunchbase page that's up to date and recent with any funding, how many employees that you have. And lastly, branding. So just making sure that you formalize your branding, clearly states what you do, it's reflected across your channels. You have a media kit available if any journalist should ask for it. But all that really needs to contain is some PNGs of your logos, a few screenshots of your product or services, a little bit of a about you blurb. If a journalist does write up a story involving you, they've got those assets to hand. So that's kind of getting the basics right. So the next thing is media and journalist targeting. The way we always look at this, and it's kind of helpful to conceptualize it, is that you've got on the one hand top tier media, so things like TechCrunch, New York Times, Bloomberg, the BBC, and on the other hand, you've got everything else that we put into industry media. So these are the sort of publications you've probably never heard of unless you actually work in that industry. They're the sort of publications where you find out what's going on in your industry, new starters, leavers at your competitors, new products, businesses launching, new funding that's been achieved by companies in that industry. And for us, well, and for our clients, of course, everybody wants to get into top tier media. That's the ultimate type of results. But where you've got to first start building up your footprint, where you can get those initial wins is with industry media. Particularly if you're a small or medium-sized business and you maybe haven't had that much media coverage before, it'd be a bit of a mistake and a waste of resource to start targeting top-tier media immediately. You want to go for those easier wins, those places where your product, your service, and what you do fits more neatly with the editors of those publications. So on to the next slide. And when it comes to thinking of the sort of industry media that you should target to get into, the way we do this, we split it into two camps. So in this example, this is for ourselves, for intelligent relations, doing this exercise. So on the one hand, like what are the industries that we're present in? So primarily that's PR. Second industry that's an adjunct to that is marketing and advertising. And a third one, we could kind of say that we've got one foot in SEO as well because of the overlap between PR and SEO. Within those three industries, there are very specific publications that report on each of them. So there's about 10 publications that report on the PR industry. There's about 15 to 20 publications that report on the marketing advertising industry. And there's about 4 or 5 good publications that report on the SEO industry. Then on the other side, the other category is like our clients' industries. So the bulk of our clients, what type of industries are they in? Although we've got clients across the board, if we were to pick some of the common clusters of where we've got clients, that'd be sort of the general tech industry, financial services, cybersecurity, healthcare, data analytics, robotics, and so on. And by dividing the sort of industries that are relevant to us into two camps, we can start to research and build a list of the publications that fall into each of those industry categories. And secondly, we can start thinking about the types of stories that each of those categories of publications would be interested in. So when it comes to our industry, it's going to be stories that our peers, people with similar jobs and similar companies to ours within our industry are going to be interested in reading about. So it could be our thoughts on the future of the industry, it could be practical advice pieces as to how companies like ourselves can be more efficient. And then on our clients' industries side, going to be more practical advice to businesses within those industries that are trying to achieve the thing that we're providing that service to. So we could come out with stories like how to bootstrap PR for your financial services company, how to win media coverage for your cybersecurity company, we could kind of have the same pitch and we could just rebadge it numerous times to fit the different industry use cases that we're going after. And I'm using our own agency and platform Intelligent Relations as an example, but any business can apply that kind of a thought process to find what are the industries that they're in, what are the industries that their clients are in, build those lists, start thinking of the kind of stories that could be relevant to each of those audiences. Okay, so in terms of actual techniques to now go out there and start getting media coverage. So technique number one, so when and how to actually use press releases. So as mentioned at the top of the webinar, this shouldn't be the default and the only way you can get media coverage. So there are times you should use it and there are times you shouldn't. So on the times when you should use it column, any kind of launch announcement. So if you're a business that's about to get off the ground, it's worth putting out a press release just so you've got a reference point out there. And you're aggregated on Google News, and there's some information out there about you when people search for you. Next stage we always advise is any major funding announcement. If a company achieves a seed round, Series A, Series B, always put out a press release for that and put it out at least to your industry media. Could even be worth putting out to bigger media, depending on how big that raise is. Any kind of major partnership, particularly if you formed a partnership with a company that's much bigger to you. So again, that'll be of interest to the media that reports on your industry. New product release, major award wins, might have slightly less traction than those ones above. They're slightly not as significant news, but again, it's worth putting those kind of stories and announcements out to industry media as well. In the no column, so a press release should never be used to promote a discount or a sale or a promotion or anything like that. Because an editor at a publication is just not going to be interested in that type of story. If it's a minor product update, you fixed a couple of bugs, for example, you have a small event that's coming up, you put together some really thin research findings that doesn't really tell us anything new. Maybe you've won an award that might have been a pay-to-play award that doesn't have a huge amount of recognition. Those kind of things we would consider minor, and you probably wouldn't get coverage, so it's not really worth the investment of putting out a press release. So in terms of how you should then write the press release, so rather than just thinking about this in terms of I have a thing to announce, you want to wrap it into a bigger angle, like explain why it matters in the release. So it could be that you're launching a product that's solving a particular problem, or you're launching something that's going to address a need in the market. Maybe you've reached a new funding round because it's going to help you achieve towards a certain goal you have at the end. Or maybe you've come up with some startling findings that sheds new light or challenges the orthodoxy or disproves previously considered things about the topic. All of those kind of things are how you want to build context into a press release. Sort of explains to an editor or a journalist at a publication, why you're not just trying to talk about yourselves and why what you're announcing fits into a bigger narrative within the news. But in terms of how to lay out a press release, and we've got a lot of resources on our website that we'll share in our wrap-up email after this webinar, so you can read that in your own time. But broadly speaking, you want to put the most important information up top, and then as you get into it, add the more insignificant details, add quotes, add the context that you're trying to build out. So, and a journalist, when they're reading press releases, they expect it to be written in a certain way so they can pass that information very quickly. They know what it's about, who's involved in it, and why it's significant and why it matters. And another question we get a lot from clients and from other people that we work with is, so I've written the press release, what do I do now? How do I actually go from getting this thing that I've written to actually then getting it published in the type of media outlets that I want to get into? So broadly speaking, this breaks down into two categories. So one is you could use a newswire service or a press release distribution service. So some of the major ones are things like Cision, PR Newswire, AccessWire. So these companies, for a set fee, so it could be somewhere from $500 to $2,000, you can upload your press release. They have agreements that will automatically syndicate that press release across a lot of different news outlets that they've got within their network. The other option you've got is direct sending. So you can write up your press release into an email, write a bit of a pitch at the top, then you can build a list of publications that you're trying to get into. So going back to that kind of industry, my industry type of media outlets, find the editor email address at each of those publications, or some of them may have a page on their site that advises exactly how to submit a press release, like this example here with Crowdfund Insider, and then pitch that press release one at a time to each of those target publications that you're trying to get into. Of course, the question we always get asked is, well, which is better? Like, which is going to get me the bigger chance of pickups? And the answer is it kind of depends. So on the one hand, press release distribution services, they have their use. They're a guaranteed way to get your press release featured on a number of websites for a set amount of money. The problem, though, with those services, one, they can be pretty expensive, particularly if you're trying to bootstrap this. Secondly, a lot of the publications that it publishes your press release onto are often completely unrelated to what it is that you do. So there's kind of limited value in getting media coverage on those places. So often it's local cable news websites across different American towns and cities. Often it's very niche industry sites that don't have that much of a footprint, that much of a following. So on the one hand, it can guarantee you placement, you can get a lot of pickups. On the other hand, those pickups aren't always going to be the most relevant to what it is that you're doing. On the other hand, direct sending, this is, if you're truly bootstrapping, the choice for you. It's zero cost other than the time it takes you to find those email addresses and send out those emails. There's no guarantee that you're going to get pickup, but if you target the right publications, so you're just going after the media that reports on your industry, and you're being selective about the press releases you're putting out. So it might be that you've signed a big, well-known client. It might be that you've hired a new C-level executive that's got a lot of experience in the industry. Those kind of stories pitched to the right outlets, to outlets that report on your industry, always have a good chance of getting picked up in a number of the outlets that you're trying to target. Okay, so technique number 2 is byline pitching. So bylines or guest articles or guest posts, they come with a lot of different names. And this is another very effective technique to get regular media coverage in different types of outlets. So most media outlets, be they in these examples here, tech or business publications, or in the many, many hundreds of different industry outlets split by different industries, most of them, or a good majority of them, will invite you to pitch ideas for guest articles that you then write yourself, and they'll then publish under your own name. Next slide. So there's a couple of things to think about before you start doing this for your own business. So one is all articles must be non-promotional. So again, we get a lot of clients that sort of kick back on this and say, well, what's the point in me getting something published if I can't actually talk about what it is that I do? So I think the thing that's often misunderstood here is just because an article is non-promotional doesn't mean that you can't speak about what it is you're doing or your experience or your view on a certain thing. If I go to the next slide, there are a number of benefits to doing this, although it can't just be a pitch for your product. So one is it builds your social proof. If you're writing stories about what your view is on an upcoming piece of, say, regulation that's being proposed by the government and the impact that could have on your industry, that creates some light influence, builds your profile as a thought leader within the industry. It could also earn valuable backlinks for your website. Most of the time when you get a guest article published, it'll include a link back to your site. The more links you have, the better your website SEO is. And the last point, you can use this to build narratives that are very beneficial to your business. So it could be, as we were talking about at the top of the webinar, you're pitching to the industry media that your clients are in. You could be writing articles that are sort of providing solutions to problems that these people have, that your product ultimately provides that solution to. So, okay, you can't pitch your product as the solution to that explicitly in the article, but you can still talk more broadly around how businesses maybe need to introduce certain automations, and it could be that your product provides those automations. In our case, we would put out stories around how businesses in certain industries can best interact with the media, And of course, it's our services that can help them do that interaction and win that media coverage. So in terms of coming up with byline ideas, so we find that a lot of people, they get excited about this, they see the value and the benefits, but they get a bit of a writer's block when it comes to what kind of ideas they should generate to get these wins. So we have a bit of a 3-step process. So step 1 is research the media landscape. So have a look at the kind of the kind of publications that you're trying to get into. You'll be able to see on there which of those articles were written by a contributor, as it'll say so in the byline, and just get a feel for the kind of stories that are getting published, the kind of topics, themes that you're seeing again and again across these different publications. And it could be something like there's something on the horizon in the industry. Often that's going to be government regulation or deregulation, a new law, a new proposal that's going to shake things up that a lot of people are talking about. It may be a cyclical calendar event. Something's coming up in your industry. If you're a retailer, Black Friday. If you're a travel company, the holiday break. Anything that's kind of topical and on the horizon is also something to talk about. Or often it's just writing about a known problem, pain point that people have in your industry or other industries, and then offering to write an article that provides some practical advice as to how people can solve that problem or overcome that pain point. And of course, step 3 is outreaching to those publications you've identified are relevant using the same steps we talk about in the press release piece. So an example of how we've done this for clients in the past. So for this company or this individual, this was kind of the counter-narrative example where this is during the lockdown and during COVID. We went out with stories around how COVID was kind of putting the stop to people traveling, doing deals and getting investment from venture capital. And then we put some stories out there around how, in actual fact, this is a good thing because it means alternative types of funding will then become available. And the person we were pitching this on behalf of, he was involved in those alternative types of funding. So this is a great example of where we weren't explicitly promoting an individual or their business, but we were putting out stories that were ultimately beneficial to the sort of products that they provide, the sort of business that they're in. Okay, so technique number 3 is responding to journalists' requests. And this is something that a lot of people are familiar with and may be using themselves. So the main tool to use this is Harrow, or Help a Reporter Out. It's a free service that you can sign up to. Once you sign up, you get 3 emails a day, morning, midday, and afternoon. And it's basically a collated list of all the questions that journalists that are using this platform have in any one day to help kind of provide sources and support for articles that they're working on. So most of the time, they're just looking for proven experts in different topics, different industries, to provide their opinion or some data points or some insight on certain things that they're working in. And this is split by industry, and in an average day, there's often 200, 300, 400 of these requests that come through on the 3 times a day email. It's a technique where there's a lot of opportunity, but we find you've got to kind of put quite a bit of time into this to get the pickups, because of course there's a lot of people that are using this pitching whenever there's an opportunity coming up that's relevant to them. And you've got to get in there pretty quick, and you've got to demonstrate to the journalist that you or the person you're pitching on behalf of has the right background, the right experience, and is an expert and that can truly talk about this. So when crafting pitches, be sure you're getting across your expertise, or your social proof as we call it, and that you're getting these out as quickly as possible, not leaving it until the deadline, whenever the deadline's stated, but getting that sent out as soon as you see something that's relevant to you, and that you're demonstrating why you're an expert and why you're qualified to talk about that. Okay, technique number 4 is media monitoring and relationship building. So this is a slightly bigger picture technique where there's a few different moving parts, but once you get the process down, it can be very effective at getting a regular stream of conversations going with journalists. And this is a really good technique, like I was talking about at the top of the webinar, where for companies where you only have a few things to announce in any one year, you've got to find ways to fill that dead air in between to make sure you're still getting media coverage. This, you're able to be reactive to what's in the news cycle, the sort of stories that are out there, and then inserting yourself into those conversations. So firstly, you need to set up a media monitoring process. So there's a few tools that can help you do this. A couple that we know are used very widely in the industry, Talkwalker Alerts or Feedly. With Talkwalker, you can have it scrape the internet for certain keywords, certain terms on a daily basis, for anything that gets indexed on Google News or for anything that is mentioned on Twitter. And then it will send you a daily digest email where it will show you all of the articles, the most relevant articles that contain those keywords that you're monitoring. So using ourselves as an example, could be that we want to monitor any stories that are published in any day about public relations. So we can see if there's a big public relations backlash somewhere, a company's made a really bad public relations disaster that they're then trying to fix. Maybe there's been a big investment story, a big company within public relations has secured investment, has had a merger acquisition. All of those kind of stories we'd be interested in hearing about, then try and pitch ourselves out as a source or somebody that can provide perspective on that story. Another option is Feedly, which is a little more advanced. So with Feedly, when you sign up for that, you can set up alerts by different keyword variations. You can set up alerts for certain types of publications. And you create feeds and boards where it'll automatically input certain stories that the platform thinks is most relevant to you. You can go in there daily or twice daily or every other day basis and read the stories that are relevant to you and then kind of know where the story is within your industry. So that's step one, is setting up the media monitoring, and you've then got that regular stream of stories coming into you. And after a couple of weeks, you'll start to get a feel for what are those sort of the themes. So the bigger kind of picture stories that are going to be in the news cycle for a while. So at the moment, it's anything around the economic downturn, a potential recession, these sort of bigger looming themes that are just in the news cycle. And then there's the topics. So the stories that sort of come and go quite quickly. Everyone jumps on. A few weeks later, we never hear about it again. So things like quiet quitting is a good example of a month or two ago. Every other story was about that topic for about a week, and now no one's heard about it for at least the last month. And once you start monitoring these themes and topics, you can then start pitching out to journalists that are writing about them as the second step. And these are kind of soft touch emails that you're sending out that isn't asking to publish a press release or pitching for a guest article or anything like that. It's more of just a softer relationship play that builds over time. So something like this, it's very short and sweet. I read your article on X, I have a potential source. I wanted to say, great article. I found, stock thing really interesting about it. On our end, what we're seeing is this provides your quick perspective, and then just offer like a quick one-liner as to if you ever needed a source on this or discuss any further, just let me know. It's not going to be a one and done that you're going to get an immediate success with this type of thing, but over time it compounds. The more of these emails you're sending out on a weekly basis, the more you're going to get onto journalists' radars, and the more they're going to start thinking of you when they've got the next story coming up about that topic, because you've offered to be a source. And with this type of thing, to really scale it, you want to have that list of journalists or editors prepared beforehand, which you can do from that exercise at the beginning where you identify sort of industries that you fall into. And then with those email addresses, you've got a ready-made list of people you can go out to. Use a mail merge or an inexpensive plugin for Gmail. You can very quickly send those emails out once a week, twice a week, whatever your schedule permits. Okay, and then technique number 5, so cold pitching do's and don'ts. So this is where it's, you're not necessarily responding to something a journalist has just written about. You're not sending out a press release. You're not pitching for a guest article spot in a publication. More of a cold, speculative pitch that you're just going to send out to journalists or editors of publications because, you think they might be interested. the more of these you do, the sharper you're going to get at it. So there's a few things that you need to be considerative of before you start doing this. So firstly, you gotta build an angle. So don't fall into the trap of just pitching journalists to say, I have this cool new product, I'm doing this thing, are you interested in writing about it? Instead, you need to find ways where you can insert yourself into kind of bigger themes and conversations that's already happening. So it could be something where you're providing a fresh perspective or a fresh take on something in the news. For example, Elon Musk's Twitter bid, a ton has been written about that. If you have something really specific and unique to say about that hasn't been said before, that could be of interest to journalists. On a similar theme, a story that provides new insight on a common topic. Tell the other side of a story. So maybe the narrative is all one way about a certain thing, but in your experience, it's the opposite. It's been misunderstood, or you have data that proves it's the other way around, or just generally being contrarian is a good way to send these kind of pictures out to journalists. Kind of falls into the next category of challenging the orthodoxy. We also sometimes say it's picking a fight. Why is it that the latest government proposal for X is a complete disaster and it's going to create more harm than good? Those kind of stories are often of interest to journalists and editors. And breaking new ground. So for that, might be that, say you have a lot of proprietary data and you've been analyzing that data and you found some really interesting stories, talking points, some interesting snippets. That kind of thing could be presented to journalists as we have some proprietary data. We found X, Y, Z about this topic, which is always of interest. So that concludes the first part of the webinar. In terms of some practical advice to start pitching to journalists and to get some processes in place that allow you to kind of scale it and not spend all day on this activity. As I said, we'll send a recording of the webinar as a wrap up. We'll also include links to other resources that we've got on our website that you can use to help you to do this. But in terms of, the next part's the questions and answers. Let me just load this up my side and I'll start going through these. Okay, so first question from Carlos. So what is SEO? So by that we mean search engine optimization. So the method in which you optimize your website to appear as high as possible for relevant keyword searches that are relevant to your business. The reason why PR and SEO have such a close relationship is what is fundamental to SEO is getting a lot of other websites linking to yours. And with PR, the more media wins you get, the more mentions you get in articles, journalists will usually include a link to your website when they're talking about you. So PR is a great way to get a lot of links into your website that can really help improve the SEO of your website. Okay, next question from Nicholas. Should I pay a website to publish a press release or guest article? That's a good question. The answer is kind of, it depends. So some websites will ask for a small fee for a press release. And I would judge it that if it's inexpensive, a couple of $100, look at the website. If it's one that you've heard of before, if it's one that's sort of reputable within your industry, I'll probably say that it could be worth paying that. If it's a website that you've never really heard of before or doesn't really look that established, then I'd probably say not. And guest articles, it's less common to be asked a fee for publishing guest articles. And it's usually the more shady sites that will ask for a publishing fee. So for me, that's usually a red flag if a website returns and asks for a set amount of money to publish a guest article. Okay, next question from Andre. I don't really have a lot of time for writing pitches. Any advice? Yeah, that's a common problem, and this is something that can be really resource intensive and resource heavy for people. There's a few things I think that help here. So one is clearly just the more of these you do, the more second nature it becomes, and the quicker you get at it. To begin with, there isn't you've just got to write the pitches that are going to be relevant to you. But there's a lot of resources out there that show you how to do that. And we'll share some resources when we send the wrap up email. So I think number one, just look at examples that are already out there and adapt them to your use case. Once you've got a few pitches and you've written those, kind of have those saved as your default templates that you can then use and copy paste from. So you'll have like a boilerplate intro, you'll have a boilerplate bit at the bottom that sort of explains who you are, why you're relevant to be a source. And then it's sort of the bit in the middle that just needs to be adjusted each time. So if you just sort of work off of previous model example pictures, you can be quite quick to do it. Okay, so next one is from Chris. What are some go-to sites for getting guest posts published? It kind of depends. So if you're in like tech or you're a startup, so a lot of the go-to websites to get into that are sort of seen as very respectable publications, and it's not impossible to get into the tool with the right pitch. So TechCrunch is one, VentureBeat is another one, Hacker Noon is another one that invites people to upload their guest posts. You've got to come up with a good pitch, but if you get it right, they are possible to get into. At the more industry level, any kind of publication that perhaps it's one that you've been reading for a number of years, perhaps it's one that your colleagues read, that'd be a good place to start to approach, to start pitching, to try and get into. Okay. So next question from Heather. What approach should I take when pitching to podcasts? That's a good question. And the approach isn't really that different to the pitches that we went through in the webinar. When you're pitching to podcasts, it's a little bit more about you rather than about bigger story. So start off by explaining who you are, the background you have, the expertise, experiences you have, and then put in a few talking points of specific things you can talk about on the show. And then building that list is pretty similar to working out what publications you want to get into. Start with what you know. What are the podcasts that you listen to within your industry? What are the podcasts that your colleagues, clients, partners listen to within your industry? And then just searching around on iTunes or Spotify for other podcasts that look relevant and building that list. Okay, so Angela, what are your tips for strong subject lines? Yeah, that's a huge part of success. It's just getting the person to open their email from a strong opener. So a few golden rules that we stick to internally. The one is keeping it short. After a certain amount of characters, most inboxes are just going to cut it off so it won't be seen anyway. Making it very clear at the start of the subject what it's about. So if it's a press release, put the word announcement. If it's a guest article, put the word submission. If it's just a more general like media monitoring pitch, put the word pitch. So instantly a journalist or an editor or maybe an assistant that's managing their mailbox for them actually knows what it is, be more likely to open it. And then in terms of the actual content of the copy, something that is very succinctly summarizes the angle of the piece. So if it's you're being contrarian, explain why the thing that we all think is the case is the wrong way around. If you're picking a fight, put the government's regulation on X as a disaster. Why? Keeping it pithy that just gives a lead in to what the pitch is about. Okay, next question, Erica. On average, roughly how many pitches do I need to send until I get a positive reply? The answer is it depends. So if we're talking press release pitches, if you've got a story that's of interest to the media, you go out to say a dozen industry media outlets in your industry. And a good rule of thumb is if you can get 2 to 4 of those publications to publish the press release, that's a pretty good result. If you're doing guest article pitching, if you're going out again to your own industry or your client's industry media, then if you're pitching out to say 15 to 20 and it's a strong pitch, I'd expect a success rate of 1 or 2 of those replying and saying, sounds interesting, please send the article. Okay, so Felipe, is there a certain number of press releases I should put out each month? Unless you're a huge company, less is more. So this is really saving it for when you have something really big to announce. something significant, something that's going to capture the attention of journalists. So I wouldn't see it as a numbers game at all. Strip it right back down and just think of only using it very sparingly and only using it when you have something specific and significant to say. As Felipe, is there a certain, sorry, I've already mentioned that one. Santi, how often can I send pictures to the same journalist? This is a really good question and something to be mindful of. So certainly you don't want to be contacting the same journalist more than once a week, more than once every 2 weeks. As a general rule of thumb, we try and give it between 2 to 3 weeks between pitching the journalist and pitching that same journalist again. So if you can kind of think of it like that, that's kind of a safe buffer where the journalist is not just going to get sick of you endlessly pitching them. Okay, Chris, second and last question. Are the backlinks and press release distributed via newswire websites good for SEO? Generally speaking, no, they're kind of SEO neutral, although some of those companies will try and tell you otherwise. That's because the links are usually set to no follow, which tells Google that these links are being paid to be there and should be disregarded. So although you get a lot of links from doing that, there's pretty much zero to very little value for SEO. Okay, and last question is from Catherine. Is there a source to help narrow the pubs you should be pitching to, engaging with in your industry? Yeah, that's a really good question. So there's a lot of ways to build lists of publications. There's a very manual way to do it where you can just search for your industry name, news in Google, and just go through all the page one results. There's good tools such as SimilarWeb, where that will help you start off maybe with 1 or 2 publications that you read regularly within your industry. You can use SimilarWeb, and it will then tell you the nearest competitor websites to those websites, and then so on and so on. You can build out a big web of all of the different publications that are sort of relevant within your website. And there's other places like FeedSpot that aggregate websites by certain industries. So I'd say what's good to begin with is kind of a mix of just start with what you know, what you read, your colleagues, clients, partners read, a bit of old-fashioned searching on Google, then using a tool like SimilarWeb to identify similar websites. And then ultimately it comes down to your own discretion once you've built that big list of the websites that you feel are worth it. So of course, any ones that you're familiar with and you've heard of, go for it. Websites that you might not have heard of before but report on your industry, a good metric to use to just see how big that website is. So one is the SimilarWeb Chrome plugin. That'll tell you the monthly visits to the website. You might want to set the bar at something like 50,000 or 100,000 monthly visits if it's a niche industry website. And then you could also use the Moz toolbar, which gives you what it calls a DA score, which is how authoritative it ranks that website from 1 to 100. And a rule of thumb might be that any website with a score of 20 or 25 and below, you want to cut and just focus on those websites that have got more authority. Okay, thanks for your questions, everyone. Those are some really interesting points to add on to the end there. Just before I wrap, I wanted to just mention that we have got our own platform, which I said at the top of the call. So it's an AI-powered PR platform that kind of automates a lot of the things that I went through on the webinar in terms of coming up with pictures, finding relevant journalists, media monitoring stories. We've managed to condense it down into workflows that really just need you to review and approve and send out pictures. That is $89 a month, and we'll be sending out a promo code for webinar attendees that will give you a month free if you want to try the platform for yourself. And then it just renews on to $89 a month after that if you want to keep using it. So thanks everybody for your time. Really appreciate you all joining and sending those questions in. I'll send a wrap-up email later today with a recording of the webinar and a promo code if anybody wants to use our platform free for 1 month. And keep an eye on your inbox. We'll be sending out the invite for the next webinar. It'll be in November in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks a lot, everyone.